Thank you, Harriet. We started a bit late, for those of you that came in late. And so we're going to take 20 minutes now for discussion. So we'll cut a little bit into our coffee time, but make sure we have plenty of time for discussion as well as for coffee. So are there questions? Roberto?
I have 3 questions, one for each speaker. I'm very democratic following your example. First question for Ralph. I wonder if maybe because of the pressure of time, but you didn't go into details on how your case studies actually carry out monitoring and evaluation of the process. And maybe it's too soon in the process, but I wonder, how are you considering the monitoring and evaluation of those processes? And the reason is that most of the lessons that can be extracted require a very particular effort to extract those lessons. What works, what doesn't work from those cases, and how can they be used for the following generation of projects? And another additional issue is, how is your international network, well, in this case, here in Habitat, an international organization, are supporting the outstanding relationship between universities and planners, decision makers. And that can work for 1-2 years, but often tends to be fragile if there is not the support coming from a broader basis. In this case, could be international, could be through regional or national networks that could at least provide them some incentive to maintain that relationship going. For Shuaib, I was struck by your presentation. It was very interesting for the case of Africa. I guess one of the key lessons that I can extract for that resonates with a lot of the research we're doing in other parts of the world is the importance of the legal framework, and how about we have neglected actually that in the analysis of governance and institutions and actions in urban areas. So I wonder if there are any efforts regarding, in your case, in Africa, to create some legal framework. I know that some countries are now debating, for instance, some countries in the South are debating about creating climate change laws. For instance, Mexico is debating right now one new law for climate change with a lot of criticism and a lot of emphasis. And the problem is to bring together how the common legal framework, the existing legal framework is adjusted to incorporate this new dimension created by climate change. So I wonder if you have any comments on that. And for Harriet, I also found your presentation very interesting. And I wonder if you could elaborate if the first part of your presentation that has this critical analysis about the tales of governance and governance filling that gap is related to the second part, which is the research you're carrying out. And here, my question is, because cities in such diverse regions are very different and very heterogeneous. And the first part tend to focus to a certain type of region or cities in certain conditions, where, for instance, looking into the materials that how the pipe works, assumes that the pipe works more or less the same way for the vast majority of the city. And in many cases, that is not the case, for instance, in other regions, where the pipes works for very small parts of the city, and the vast majority is not served for those pipes. So I wonder how those two parts are connected. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's collect just a few more questions.
I'm very appreciative of the discussion around linking experimentation to city scale, which was mentioned earlier, and then the last point here about making space for experiments in the city. And I think it raises the critical question of what is an experiment, and how do you experiment as a methodology in this kind of, in terms of in a more rapid approach, or in situations where you may not have the time or the capacity to implement the rigor that is more typically accustomed to a scientific process. But I think we've already alluded to the fact that experimentation, that scientists are reluctant to dumb down their experimental methodologies, partly because of funding issues and peer review and other factors. So I'd like to hear a little bit of discussion about how you might balance the issue of gleaning rapid information and getting useful data with the constraints of the researcher and the potential for the quality of the data to be mediocre. And how does that kind of how do you from your perspective or perspectives take on that issue?
Is there another question? Okay, then I'll ask one. I also have a question for the panelists, but particularly for Harriet, but I'd like all of you to comment. One of the things that I was unable to differentiate at a certain point was the difference between governance and government action. If we start talking about pipes, what is the governance element there? So could you clarify what you mean by that? So did anybody else want to step up before we start our responses? Thank you, so.
Thanks. On the first question regarding monitoring and evaluation, yes, it is very early. I mean, 2 years is really when we can talk about outputs and just emerging outcomes. But this is a continuous process, and I think it happens at least 3 levels. First of all, locally, which is really, the bottom line is really whether we can carry through different municipal administrations. And in several cities, we have faced the test of re-election, and the program continues, and that's really our ultimate, success factor, I believe. At the national level, it's really most of the cities, and I think as Shuaib has also mentioned, in Philippines, for instance, we also have an urban forum where these experiences are discussed at a regular level and kind of critically looked at their validity for transfer, which I think is a valid internal national monitoring mechanism. At the international level, as I mentioned, we have, as much as we can, we bring cities from different experiences together, talk about their experiences, try to learn lessons for a next cycle, and we have, of course, formal, let's say, program evaluation processes which are going on. So yes, it's there, but I think it's a little bit early to have anything definitive after 2 years. On your question, or 2 questions related to this, linking between universities and and decision makers at the local level. What we try to do is really give opportunities for narrowing sometimes these difficult relationships between universities who have their own agenda and cities who are reluctant to work with universities, basically bringing them closer together, bringing city managers into the university and bringing university professors into the city, and getting them out of their ivory tower or their kind of day-to-day concerns and narrowing these gaps. But we can only offer opportunities to do that within the framework of a program. But in the long run, we are, as I mentioned, also working on curricular development with networks of universities, also with local government academies, where we try to give some incentives at the global level and at regional level, and then bring universities together and see how they can incorporate new values, new ways of thinking on climate change in their curricula. So that's a little bit our plan, but of course the agenda is huge. It's a long-term struggle.
I have a question on the consideration of legal frameworks from Roberto. I think one needs to look at the history of how laws and policies come by in our countries, and that history is characterized by international donor, sometimes pushed or donor-led initiatives to do that, or international agreements. I can give an example of the Rio Summit that hammered out Agenda 21, and then there was a suggestion to have our member states to create policies and laws that would support the implementation of Agenda 21. So in this respect, what is happening in Uganda or in the region is in very, very advanced, rather not advanced, but early stages of even getting to understand issues of climate change, issues of global environmental change. There is a lot of activities going around in national initial communication, and then debates about climate policy in the case of Uganda and several other countries. And the incentive for that kind of debate is the existence of some of the funds, like the adaptation fund, which is now existing. So the kind of thing going on is early stage discussions and understanding climate change issues, and not much in the direction of starting to debate whether these legal structures would be created. But when that time comes, that it would require to have the legal backing of any implementation of maybe a project, then that's when there is a rush to really coming up with the legal framework. And that's where I pose that question. Such legal frameworks that are driven by external forces, external interested parties, do they really address the real issues, and do they really often give or lead to good or right things? Maybe yes, maybe not, and that needs to be looked into.
Is it working now? Yes, thank you. Okay, quite a lot on experimentation and pipes. In terms of JoAnn's question about what is the governance in a pipe, that is, I mean, this is where I show my true academic colours. There are two answers really from theory to that question. The first is that the way in which infrastructure provides services to us shapes our conduct. In the UK, we used to recycle nothing. Then local authorities provided us with green bins, and now we fill them up extremely dutifully. Local authorities had previously tried to get us to recycle through education campaigns, but it wasn't until the object appeared in our households that we started changing what we do. There are a myriad of stories around energy about how when nuclear power stations were built in the UK in the 60s and 70s, we had to invent something called night storage heaters because they were on all the time, so we had to invent new ways of using energy in the middle of the night when nobody was up and stuff like that. So the way in which infrastructures shape our conduct is the way in which they, and in doing that, govern our behaviour. They govern the way in which we think about the world as well. But perhaps more politically, a more political, economic understanding of the way in which water infrastructures shapes the city, and this also gets back to Roberta's question, is the way in which certain interests and actors are invested in certain forms of water infrastructure, creating what is termed in the literature incumbent regimes, which become very difficult to shift. So there's a good reason why we don't have lots of decentralised and renewable energy in the UK. It's not a technological one, but it's about the powers and interests that are vested in the infrastructure network, literally solidified in that set of relationships. And to get to the sense of whether you need the water pipes to be working in order that technologies or infrastructure networks can govern the city, I think not at all. I mean, any sort of infrastructure network, whether it's fragmented or otherwise, governs a city. It might be prone to governance failure, but it still is governing what we do. And in fact, one of my students who's working in Mumbai at the moment suggests that the extremely patchwork and intermittent supply of water in that city is one of the reasons why rainwater harvesting technologies are emerging, that is providing actually spaces, if you like, for innovation and experimentation. Now that could be about a politics of securing resource for the better off, rather than, it certainly is in many ways, rather than about providing basic needs. The justice elements of the experiment is another question of whether or not that experimentation is taking place. I hope this also sort of suggests the way in which I'm thinking about experiments is not in a laboratory sense. There are urban laboratory experiments run by universities seeking to look at these kind of processes, but they are about long-term and collaborative responses. They're not about short-term answers to get to that question. But what we're seeking to understand is the actors who are involved in experimenting in the city, the architects, the planners, the energy companies, the engineers, the municipal authorities, the local communities. lots of forms of grassroots innovation going on. How are they seeking to change what is happening in the city, and can that lead to a transition? And this is where it kind of connects with some of the talk that Bill was giving yesterday about how do we understand the process of transition. We're looking at these experiments, or what's called in another literature on transitions, niches, as means through which broader transitions in the city can occur. And we find some evidence for that, but that's a much longer story.
Thank you. We have a question in the back, please.
Many thanks, Chairman. This is not a question. This is a kind of concern I want to share with the community here. We are talking about governance, and we are talking about managing cities, adaptation to climate change. And all of you guys mentioned the word resources, funding. We need to bring the money to solve the problems. And my concern is to repeat what African countries has gone through in the past. The international aid has been crafting the dictatorial regimes in Africa. When the United States give money, it's because you're a liberal country, you're not a social country. And those people use that money to increase vulnerability in their own countries. Now, when we are dealing about climate change and adaptation, and when this cash flow comes in our countries, we have to raise the governance issues of well management of this budget. Because, as Shuaib said, there are several levels of decision making, from federal or governmental to local. And each of these steps, we have the issue of well managing the funds to be invested in the right place at the right time. The other point, which is the last one, is about the capacities of taking decision. We all know mainstreaming knowledge to decision making, but we know that the scientific world in Africa and the political world are two worlds aside. It's difficult to create this junction, and I'm happy that the guy from UN Habitat is here. He knows they are having a lot of action in Senegal at least, and other countries. There is a big issue of fear. They are fearing that the scientists will open the box where they are doing their business in, because we are open-minded and we say things as we see. So there is this problem of communicating between scientists and decision makers. That is a short comment.
Well, I didn't say my name yesterday. I'm Patty, and I want to apologize for that. But I really love the idea of transitions, but I think that rather than thinking on one source of transitions, we need to think on a couple of sources of transitions and triggers of transitions, and consider that history tells us that not all transitions go the way we would like them to go. And I think that what you are doing is great and is a good starting point, but that we would need to explore more sources of triggers or tipping points, and to understand that we are already biased towards, what could be the good one? And perhaps that is not the way to go.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes left. Would each of our panelists like to take 1 minute and comment on comments and conclude?
Do you get attracted to interesting, nice-looking examples? Obviously, the answer is yes, because those are the ones that still exist. So partly you're looking at the stuff that survives. If you're looking at if you're looking for projects, you look at the stuff that's there, and you don't know the hundreds of different experiments or projects that started and failed. But what we are trying to do is to look at their life over a period of time, and probably we'll end up doing about 6 relatively in-depth case studies. And we certainly don't conclude that their outcomes are all positive. In fact, we find them to be highly ambivalent. that, for example, in the case that we've looked at towards zero carbon development on the outskirts of Bangalore, this is an example which is, at the one hand, promoted a zero carbon lifestyle and also started to influence the model of urban development for high and middle income earning people in that city. It's also sustained a model of rapidly growing peripheralization of the city, and also served to try to secure water and resource interests for an elite. So it's not to say that experiments are always positive, but it is to say that climate change experiments actually exist in cities and that they are having real effects. And it's also to say that not all urban climate governance, whether it's in experiments or plans or policies, will be positive either. We look for the good and the bad.
On the point of the science and policy worlds or interface by Sheikh, I think without really making any attempt to prescribe, from our experience, one of the things that is worth exploring is possibility of finding the common ground between the science and policy worlds. And those around that, you would get hooks that would possibly interest the policy actors in working together with science. But the problem is much bigger than that, and I know, and on a personal level, I know we've discussed this, and quite often there is also thinking on our part as academics and researchers that they are in the wrong, and they always look at us as they are in the wrong. So the question is, who will then act? So I think there is need for the academics and researchers to take initiative to engage with the policy actors. And these kind of platforms that are being created or experimented, so to say, would offer some opportunities or potentialities for hooks that would interest them in furthering that engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe just one comment on the Senegalese intervention about managing climate budgets and transparency related to that. What we are seeing, and you know, this is still developing in the Cancun meeting and probably through next year, that in the discussions about how to frame the adaptation financing institutional infrastructure, similar, yes, I think some of the countries are pushing for almost a similar concerns for measuring, reporting, and verifying and validating in a similar way as you would measure, report, and validate emissions, that you would do the same in terms of adaptation. Now, while this is, I think, in principle, a good idea, it will definitely bring up a lot of questions and difficulties. How can you separate a baseline of adaptation action and then measure some progress in a way where it can be seen as purely additional and not something which is mixed with many other development factors? So I foresee a lot of difficulties once this push for transparency ends up in very complicated procedures which will rather stifle action rather than accelerate action.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking all of our panelists. And it's time for coffee.